So I've talked to all sorts of people that I have no business talking to. And if I went up to them and said, hey, can I buy you a coffee sometime and like pick your brain for 20 minutes? They'd be like, get out of here, kid. You bother me. But if I say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Big Shot Smarty Pants, can I interview you on my podcast? They're like, oh yeah, what's the link? I'll sign up now. So that's, I think, one of the biggest things that I just started like, oh, I can talk to people I have no business talking to.
Hey there, Pitches. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Pitched. I am your host, Angie Trueblood, a podcast guesting and hosting expert and the founder of the Podwise Group, a concierge podcast interview booking agency. Now, if you are an OG listener, Happy New Year. And I know this is not the first episode of the new year, but the first episode was a little personal. This one is more traditional, as you would expect, and I just wanted to welcome you back. I hope you had a great holiday, and I so appreciate you tuning in week after every other week. If you are new here, it is so great to meet you and connect with you. Thank you for spending time with us, and I look forward to hearing what you think of the podcast. So reach out to me either through LinkedIn, or if you have good things to say, you can leave a review. If you have suggestions on how to make the show better, go ahead and reach out to me on LinkedIn at Angie Trueblood. Now, today's episode is a really exciting one for me because I got to interview someone that I respect, one that is well known in the podcast industry, Mr. Dave Jackson. If you are unfamiliar with who he is, I will share more, but just know he has been podcasting since before there was really a name given to the industry. So he has seen it all. And it's an interesting conversation because when he and I connected and I asked him if he had a story about a pitch that he would like to share, he said, I know this sounds really weird, but my podcast is my pitch. And I thought, I love that. Let's dig into it. So I think there's a lot of takeaways you're going to get from my conversation with Dave. But before we dig in, as always, it is time for our Podcast Love of the Week segment. So obviously this week it is Dave's show, School of Podcasting. Now, fun fact, that is not the only show that Dave hosts. He hosts a number of shows, many of which I am a fan. You can see them all at powerofpodcasting.com and take your pick on the Dave Jackson buffet. But School of Podcasting is really his flagship show. It is the one that I first discovered and the one that I listen to regularly. If you are thinking of starting a podcast, but you do not know where to start, or you have a podcast and you really are looking for up-to-date advice on how to grow or monetize your show, the School of Podcasting is for you. So Dave not only shares what to do, like the things you should be doing, but he also shares what you should not be doing in a way that, for me, is entertaining and educational, which is my favorite part of the show. So you can find School of Podcasting in your podcast player. Hop on over now, hit follow, and soak up his 18 plus years of podcasting experience from Dave Jackson, who happens to be a Podcaster Hall of Fame inductee. So legit, his show is one you should be listening to. Okay, friend, as I mentioned, today we are chatting with Dave Jackson, who began podcasting way back when in 2005, which is when he launched the School of Podcasting show. The podcast has over 3.1 million downloads, and he has helped hundreds of people plan, launch, and grow their podcast. He is the author of the book Profit from Your Podcast and is a featured speaker at all the events. I have seen him at several. In 2016, which we will talk about during our conversation, Dave actually joined Libsyn, the largest podcast hosting company, the one that I use, as part of their tech support team. And in 2018, he was inducted into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame. So, how did this interview come to be? Well, Dave actually reached out to me after seeing a question that I posed inside of Kevin Schmidlin's Grow the Show for Podcasters Facebook group. It's a free Facebook group. I love it. It's one of my go-tos when I have a question about podcasting, my stats, all the things. After Dave and I connected in Facebook Messenger and chatted a bit, I asked if he had a pitch story that he would be up for sharing on the show. And his answer, as I mentioned, was my podcast is my pitch. So this conversation actually does go in a myriad of directions because I could not have Dave Jackson on the show and not ask him podcasting questions. I couldn't just stick to the script of pitching, right? So there are two takeaways, though, that I think are really important for you to know on the front end about how a podcast can be your pitch. He touched a lot on networking and credibility building. And this is true for any pitch. If there is a way for you to have an in with someone who is a decision maker, and if there is a way for you to allow others to get to know you and build that know, like, and trust factor, you are going into the pitch conversation or the pitch event ahead of the game. So listen to that kind of through line as you hear Dave tell his story and how his podcast has evolved over the years. So also listen to kind of what I would like to refer to as bonus content when I was just picking his brain because I couldn't not since he and I were talking. All right, I can't wait for you to hear this. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Dave Jackson. Dave Jackson, welcome to the Pitched Podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
Angie, I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, this will be great. So we're going to jump right in. The conversation you and I are having is a little different than what we typically take on the show, but your words, my podcast is my pitch, struck me so much in our conversation that I wanted to bring it to our audience. We're going to take it way back to 2005 when you launched the podcast. Tell the listeners a little bit about what was going on back then that prompted you to launch the School of Podcasting.
At the time, they were saying membership sites are going to be the next big thing. And then a friend of mine, I'd been doing a blog for musicians, and he was a music marketing guy. And he came back from this big conference and he said, I know what the next big thing's going to be. And I said, great, what is it? And he goes, podcasting. And I went to Google and I searched for it, and 1.5 pages came up. And I went, how do you spell that again? Because I think we broke the internet. And there was literally 1.5 pages. So I put one together. Back then, it was like rubber bands and paper clips to get it to work.
Yeah.
And I just remember I uploaded a file and I saw it come down in my software and I was like, oh. And so I just took my blog and turned it into a podcast. It was for musicians about how to get more gigs and sell more CDs and things like that. And a guy from Nuremberg, Germany emailed me, a voicemail basically. And I just remember hitting play and hearing, hello, Dave, this is Michael Van Laar from Nuremberg, Germany. My brother was behind me. He's like, did he say Germany? All of a sudden, like the light bulb, kind of like I knew it was global, but it was one where I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's what gave me the bug. I was like, wait a minute, because my background's in teaching. And I was like, wait, I now have a global audience. Marketers see it as I can sell to everyone. Teachers see it as like, I can learn so much from this. We're all going to teach each other. But that's what really got me going.
Okay. So that's really interesting. I pictured that you had started it because, School of Podcasting suggests that you had been podcasting for a while, but that's not the case?
I'd been doing the original music show for about, I'd say 2 months.
Okay.
And it's funny because the thing I did is the thing I tell everybody not to do. But I ended up having to go back to school. I lost my job and was going to go back to school because I'd been teaching forever at that point, but I didn't actually have a teaching degree. I had an electronics engineering degree. And so I was like, I need to make money to go back to school. And so I was like, well, I'm going to take this membership thing that everybody's saying is going to be the next big thing and podcasting. And it's like a Reese cup. Let's put these together and see what happens.
Yeah.
The bad news is when you try to make money quickly with a podcast, because the first thing you need is an audience. And this is 2005. So I'm asking people, hey, do you listen to podcasts? And they're like, do I need an iPod for that? And it was just painful. So the first couple of years of the School of Podcasting, yes, I did that. But I also played in a band. I also gave guitar lessons. I built websites. So it was hard the first couple of things. But yeah, so that was back in 2005. Basically, I started in April of 2005. And then the School of Podcasting came along around July, I think. So a couple months.
Well, I love that you mentioned you need an audience, because I think I posted on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. It was around that time that you and I connected when I saw my downloads looking wonky on the back end. And I feel like so many people in the podcasting space say downloads are just a vanity metric, like downloads don't matter. I'm like, well, actually, I'm trying to help people and serve people. And so they do actually matter, especially if you want to grow into something that you can profit from.
It's a great metric to see what's working and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
Downloads in some way is great if you're trying to get advertisers, but if you're selling your own products and services, I don't want to say you don't care, because there's still a metric to gauge what's working or not. But we do get hung up a little bit on downloads. I always tell people staring at your stats will not make them grow, but boy, do people love to stare at their stats.
Yeah, for sure. Or not at all. Like there's a happy medium. Like you got to know them, but then you don't have to obsess over them.
Yeah.
Okay. So launched around July 2005.
Yeah.
At what point did you start to see, one, that people were listening to it, and two, the impact that a podcast could actually have on your career and your professional life?
I think the very first podcast conference was in Ontario, California at a Holiday Inn. And it was weird to walk into a room. And at the time, there were probably less than 100 podcasters. And so we're all in the bar because, podcasters.
Yeah.
And I walked in and they're like, oh, what's your podcast? And I said, oh, I do the School of Podcasting and the Musicians Cooler. And they're like, oh, yeah, I've heard that. And it was like, oh, wait, hold on a second. And then I had a guy come. I live in Akron, Ohio. And I always say, if you come to Akron, I will buy you Luigi's Pizza. So I take this guy to Luigi's Pizza. And he was saying how I used to, in my music show, I would say, for those who have money, there is therapy. For the rest of us, there is music. It was like my little ending tagline.
Yeah.
And he now teaches music at a university and said, I open every semester with that. And it's just stuff like that just happens where people say, oh, I heard this episode and I did this or that. And so at that event, it was funny because I have a friend of mine, Paul Culligan, who's another podcast consultant. And he said, if we got enough people listening to this, I'm pretty sure we could make some money at this. And at the time, we were almost like pitchfork and torches out of there because it was your art, man. Nobody was thinking about doing it's your art. And plus, we were very much flipping the middle finger to radio. We did not want to be radio. And so to even hint that you could monetize your podcast in 2005, they're like, take him away. But that was one that I was like, I think he's got a point.
At the Holiday Inn, what were the types of podcasts that folks back then were launching?
It's weird. Back then, there was a resource that's no longer available called the PodSafe Music Network. And it was where musicians could just upload their music and say, have at it. You have my permission. So there were a lot of people making music shows. So there were that. And then most of them back then were tech shows because only the nerds could figure out how to make a podcast. A Slash.weekly, This Week in Tech with, that guy.
I know him.
But a lot of music shows. And they're really good music shows because they were hyper niche. This one guy it wasn't just blues, it was electric blues. So none of this acoustic stuff from Blind Lemon Peel Johnson from the 20s. It sounds like somebody's playing a guitar while cooking bacon underwater. It was all electric blues. So there was a lot of music shows back then. And then we've had different waves. It was music, then it was language. All of a sudden everybody's like, oh, I can learn a language with this. And then the tech stuff came along. And then there was comedy. So you had the Carollas and the Mark Marons, and then true crime, which is still going on. I'm like, really? We have another new show about how to kill someone and not get caught. And so there are all sorts of different waves along the way. The business shows with the John Lee Dumases of the world. So it's been fun watching different things go away. And now it's watching, like Brazil right now is just exploding with podcasting.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been into podcasts. So I quit my corporate job back in 2014. And I was listening to podcasts then. That was one of my motivators to quit and come home and really step out into my own thing. And I just remember some of them were almost like serious radio talk shows that they had been started to upload. I don't even remember what I used to listen to them. But I definitely went through periods where people had no idea what a podcast was. And I thought they were nuts because I was listening to them all the time.
My favorite was I was at a family picnic and finally somebody said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I go, what? He's like, what's a podcast?
Yeah.
And I'd been talking about podcasting for 5 years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, give me your phone. And I went to show him, and half my cousins came out of the woodwork. They're like, wait, hold on. I got to see this. And here, nobody in my family had any clue what the heck I was talking about. They're just like, yeah, that's his podcasting thing, whatever. So it was pretty funny.
If I had a nickel for every time I had to show someone like a lacrosse game for my son, their actual phone and the podcast app, we would be rich from that, Dave. Can we monetize that way, please?
That's it. It's a small
$1.
fee. I will show you how to listen to podcasts. Exactly.
Yes. All right. So you started to recognize that people were knowing you and listening to the show and that you had something there. I want to move into once you realized the potential that the show had, that people were listening and were recognizing you because of it. Did you make any changes production-wise, content-wise to really dial it in to figure out what it could become for you?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed was I've heard people getting opportunities. Like I remember one guy, I think it was just called the Sales Podcast or something very obvious like that. And he actually landed a big deal because the CEO heard his podcast on a treadmill and said, call this guy. He said, well, what was funny, he goes, I'd been just bumping heads with the gatekeeper. And so I was like, huh. So I still had my music show, and I basically started reaching out to people that were kind of my heroes growing up. So I got to interview the bass player and the drummer from Ozzy Osbourne and the singer from Rainbow. And these are all bands back in the 80s. And I was like, huh. So that's one that I was like, okay, I can actually use this because I know I'm in the basement next to a water heater in a furnace, hoping no one flushes the toilet. But they don't know that. And all they know is it's some sort of internet radio show. So many times I have people say, well, should I do a solo show or should I do like an interview show? And I go, why not do both? Because when you do a solo show, you grow your influence. And I always talk to one person, none of this YouTube, hey guys. No, I'm like, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. I talk to one person. And so that grows your influence. And then interviews grow your network. So I've talked to all sorts of people that I have no business talking to. And if I went up to them and said, hey, can I buy you a coffee sometime and like pick your brain for 20 minutes? They'd be like, get out of here, kid. You bother me. But if I say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Big Shot Smarty Pants, can I interview you on my podcast? They're like, oh yeah, what's the link? I'll sign up now. So that's, I think, one of the biggest things that I just started like, oh, I can talk to people I have no business talking to.
Okay. So you started to not play bigger, but just open up the options that you were considering for guests.
I tried to turn down the imposter syndrome because I'm like, well, they would never talk to me. And I just found out that there's one guy, his name's Carmine Appice, and he wrote Do You Think I'm Sexy? For those of us that are old. Back in the 70s, played with Rods. And if you're a musician, you know who Carmine Appice is. And I saw that he had launched some sort of website where he was teaching drumming. And I was like, he has something to promote. And I reached out and like within, I don't know, a couple hours, like, yeah, sure. Here's my number. I'm like, oh, okay.
Did you describe it as a podcast, or a second ago you called it an internet radio show?
I do. Back then it was called the Musicians Cooler Podcast. And then I would put in parentheses, an internet radio show, because nobody knew what they were.
That's amazing. I love it. All right. Let's start moving into some of the opportunities. There was one specific one that you shared with me with New Media Expo, and I'm not very familiar with who they are. So share a little bit about who they are and then what came up.
Yeah, so I had been podcasting at this point for probably 5 years, and I knew everybody at every media host. I had interviewed them on my show. There was a guy named Rick Calvert. He ran the New Media Expo, and at the time, it was the biggest event for blogging, podcasting, video. I mean, if there's any kind of content creation, it was ginormous. And the guy that ran their podcasting track had left, and they needed a new guy. Rick called Libsyn, and then he called Blueberry, and these are all media hosting companies, and he called Spreaker. And all three of those guys said, what do you think about Dave Jackson? So Rick called me, he goes, I'm tired of calling people because they're all just telling me to call you. And I got to do that. And what was great about it is that led me to then I had to hire all the speakers for that event. And one of them was Pat Flynn. And Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income, really super popular guy. And so I got to know Pat. I consider him a friend. He's really hilarious. And so I always say podcasts lead to opportunities, and those opportunities lead to relationships, and the relationships lead to more opportunities, and it just kind of spirals. So fast forward probably 5 years after that, I'm at another podcast event, and here comes Pat Flynn. So I start talking to Pat Flynn. Up walks Michael Stelzner. And Michael Stelzner runs another event called the Social Media Marketing World. And so I got to kind of share my podcasting experience with a conversation with Mike and Pat. And Michael went home, listened to my podcast, and probably within a week called me and said, "Would you be interested in speaking at Social Media Marketing World?" And I was just like, man, that's luck. There's definitely some luck there. Happen to see Pat and this and that. But time after time, you can point people at your podcast, and it's just a big digital resume. They either like your style or they won't.
Well, I think it's interesting. You actually touched on two different ways that a podcast can be your pitch. I'm assuming that the people at Spreaker and Blueberry said your name. You had interviewed them on your show, right?
Yeah. I knew Rob at Libsyn. I knew at the time Rob Greenlee was at Spreaker, and I knew Todd at Blueberry. It's kind of weird because on one hand, all those guys are competition, but the podcasting space is really different, that there really isn't competition. Like, we know that when we go to an event, I'll see Todd at his booth and I'll see Rob over there, and I'm in my Libsyn booth and everything's cool. And we know that he's going to say this about my company and I'm going to say that about his. And then we go to lunch. It's like, yeah, it's just business. But who else can you geek out about than, with somebody else who does the same thing you do?
Even in my space, yesterday I got a Voxer from a friend who owns a very similar company asking something about one of the databases we're using. I just hired someone that worked for a previous one. I feel like the whole industry is fairly collaborative if everyone is, doing their own thing. And I love that about it because I do feel like there's a little bit more of a grassroots feel to podcasting than other places. So I like that definitely you met some of those key people through your podcast, but then also that the podcast that you are putting out there allows people a chance to get to know you without having to have, sure, Michael met you and seemed to think you were credible and friendly enough to go back and vet you a little bit more on your podcast. But that's really two different ways that show is serving as a pitch, through relationships and just by really getting to know you. So I think that's pretty impactful.
Yeah. And I was approached once by a publisher to write a book. And the reason they found me is through my podcast. And what's interesting is, like I said, your podcast leads to opportunities, and your opportunities lead to more relationships. And so I've been hired to go speak at places because they found my book, which pointed them at my podcast. It's just this little circle that just kind of keeps rolling along.
Have you shifted things over the years as the opportunities that have come to you have grown? Is there more strategy going into, especially the School of Podcasting, like how you produce that show?
What I've basically done is kind of weird. I don't follow my own advice. I always say have an avatar, like one. I have three. I have one person who hasn't started yet. So January's right around the corner as we record this. And in January, I will do a very Podcasting 101 episode. But then I have Ken Blanchard, who's a guy I know, and he's been podcasting for a while, and he's trying to grow his audience. So on occasion, I'll be making content like, is Ken going to find this entertaining? Is it going to be helpful to him? And then I have the person that's been doing it a while. And if I was coaching myself, I'd be like, yeah, pick one of those and go with it. My show's a little bit like a magazine. It has different segments in it. And so one will be kind of inspirational. And I'll say, look what happened to this guy. He just got to interview somebody in British Parliament. That wouldn't have happened except at his podcast. And then I'll have a thing about how to grow your audience. Do you have a link to your show in your email signature? If not, you should. And then I'll have an interview with somebody that has some sort of strategy. So the thing that I've done that it's weird, again, sounds like a humble brag, but in 2018, it messed with my head. I got inducted into the Podcasters Hall of Fame. And I came back to record and I was like, is this Hall of Fame worthy? And it really, for like 4 days, I go, what do I do?
What does a Hall of Famer do?
Yeah. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. They inducted me because they liked what I do. And all I'm doing is being myself. So I'm just going to be myself. But it took a while to do that. My next episode isn't really about podcasting, but it is a story because about a month ago, I was asked kind of impromptu to do stand-up comedy. And while I like to make people chuckle, I've never stood on stage and tried to do it on purpose. And I was standing backstage ready to explode because I was so far out of my comfort zone. So that's not about podcasting, but I can share that story and explain how I got through it because there are a lot of people that are in that boat trying to start a podcast. So that's kind of stuff that part of me goes, yeah, that's not really growing and monetizing. It's like, yeah, but A, is it entertaining? Because I always try to be entertaining. Can it be inspirational? I always say your podcast should either make people laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain. Yeah. And if you're not doing any of those, you're boring. And so I'm like, well, this should be entertaining. It should be educational, maybe inspirational a little bit. So I'm trying to figure out how to word that to where I can kind of get the story arc and that whole 9 yards. But that's going to be the next episode. And there's just part of me that my gut says you should put that out because there's somebody out there that's going to resonate with that story.
For sure.
So part of it is, yes, I have my different avatars, but there's also my gut that goes, you should put this out.
Well, you know your people. I mean, I think that's the part of it too, after you've had a podcast for so long. And you're also great at wordsmithing and bridging that gap. That's one thing we talk about a lot is in our pitches, bridging the gap of why are we reaching out and why is this relevant? But you have to do it on your own show as well, else your audience is just left there kind of standing in the dark. I love that you brought up the purpose of the shows because we do work with a lot of podcasters and a lot of our clients will sometimes go on to start their own podcast. And there was a heyday of podcasting where you could create a show as a business owner and interview other business owners about their journey and put it out there and it would roll. And in my opinion, those days are long gone unless there's commonality between the stories, unless you are pulling something very specific out. And I appreciate that there's some different things that you can hit on. We call it edutainment.
Yep.
Even how-to shows. I feel like if it's not entertaining and I have other things that I could listen to, I'm not tuning in. With regard to that, where do you feel like people, as we start talking about you having used your podcast as a pitch, where do you see people kind of missing the boat? I know there's like a million different things you could probably share, but what's one of the big, like 1 or 2 things that you see newer podcasters doing that could shift how people see them?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head. Why are you doing this? So if the idea is I want to position myself as an expert, then do a 20-minute show on one subject. If I'm doing it to keep my brand in front of people, do a quick 5-minute podcast 5 days a week. And at the end, have your call to action. And that's one of the things I see where people really drop the ball. I had a friend of mine, I'd known her for about 6 months. I helped her launch her podcast. I listened to every episode. And I said, how's the podcast going? And she goes, actually, it's going really well, but I'm not getting any speaking gigs. And I go, wait, I've known you a little while. I go, you speak to people? And she goes, yeah, I just spoke to a bunch of high school kids in the Bronx. And I'm like, I've never heard you say that. And she said, well, I don't want to be salesy. And I was like, well, you don't have to be salesy. I said, here's how you start your next episode. I was speaking to a bunch of kids in the Bronx this past weekend, and this young man came up to me and asked me this question. And I thought, that'd be a great topic for a podcast episode. I go, there you go. Now everybody knows you speak to kids. I go, it doesn't have to be the Sunday, that kind of thing. But I hear people, even if it's to share the show with a friend, we start to feel like we're a 1970s used car salesman. And so it's like, hey, if you, kind of like, you don't have to, but like, I don't know, tell somebody or whatever, my website's .com. I'm like, that's the worst pitch ever. And then they go, yeah, my show's not growing. I mean, I suffer from that as well. I had a friend of mine that's like, I told him about my book and he goes, you have a book? And I go, yeah, I got a book deal. And he's like, I've never heard you mention this. And I'm like, well, physician, heal thyself, I guess, apparently.
Yeah.
That's when I see, and then people are missing out on SEO. Whoever your media host is, they'll give you a really basic website, which is great for like Mrs. Johnson's 7th grade science class or something like that. But if you already have a website, you should take what we call the show notes, your episode description, and put that as a blog and then embed the player from whoever, again, your media host is there. And presto, you've got an instant blog, but it's a podcast on your website. Now, why is that important? Because those words is what Google likes. And so when somebody finds your show via Google search, because we all get all hot and bothered about YouTube because it's the number 2 search engine, which it is, but let's not ignore the number 1 search engine.
Yeah, exactly.
Google. And so when somebody clicks through to your site and they go, oh, wow, there's a player, click. Well, now your time on site's going to go up, which can boost your SEO. And then if somebody shares that episode because it was really good, well, then also is going to boost your SEO. The last one, I'll make this one short, is would you open a restaurant, Angie, without having somebody taste your food?
No.
Yeah, that would be a dumb idea, right? But we have authors who have rough drafts, athletes have preseason, actors have dress rehearsal, but we're going to release the very first thing we recorded and then wonder why our show isn't growing. And look, I get it. It took you 15 hours to make that first episode because you're drudging through the learning curve. But that's really a rough draft. It's one of those things where you need to find somebody not named Mom to listen to your show and then ask them for specific feedback. Don't go, so what'd you think? Because they're going to go, I thought it was good. You have to go, well, did you listen to the whole thing? No. Okay, well, that's fine. Why did you stop and how far did you make it through? And then the one I always say is on a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to share this with a friend? And if they go, I don't know, about a 7. You know, and part of you goes, well, that's a C. And I'm like, yeah, we're not looking for C's. We're looking for A's and B's. And the people I know that have done that end up with a better show because somebody goes, hey, this bread has too much salt in it. It's not the end of the world. You just go take some of the salt out and come back and they're like, oh, this is the best bread I've ever had.
Yeah. I love that so much. The blog post and the SEO piece, it is eye-opening to me. I mean, a lot of the shows that we pitch clients to are business podcasts. And when they have their show linked, a lot of times it is to their Libsyn site. And I'm like, why are we doing this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so weird. And then have on your website a way for them to follow in Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon. Those are like the top 4. And then say, oh, just go to schoolofpodcasting.com/follow instead of find me wherever you find your podcast. Because as someone who works in tech support, I'm here to tell you they're better than they used to be, but search in apps is horrible. And so go find me, have fun, good luck with that. Because especially if it's golf or real estate or some of these that have there are tons of podcasts about that. Mm-hmm. It can be tough. Whereas you send them to your website where they can subscribe or follow whatever they're going to do. It reinforces your brand. There's your website again. And there it is. And then they can share it. And yet I hear so many people say, find me wherever you find your podcast and please rate and review me because it helps us get found. And Apple has come out and said, no, it doesn't. Ratings and reviews are social proof. They do not help anything in the algorithm.
Okay, I have so many questions, Dave. Can I just fire them at you?
Yeah.
All right. And this is me just being totally honest. But if I wanted to link, we link to Apple on my website, but there's not a specific page on Apple where they can more easily follow, right? They just need to go to Apple and follow.
Right.
Okay.
But 70% of Europe uses an Android.
Okay.
So 70% of your audience. Yeah. That's why I say Apple and Spotify will cover about 70% of most podcast listeners.
Okay. I would love to get your perspective on podcast guests if you have a couple minutes, because
you've poked the bear. I had one yesterday that was like, what? Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to tell me a little bit more about that person?
There are 2 ways if you're trying to be a guest on a podcast. You can use a rifle, which will kill when you hit somebody. That's a little gruesome, but anyway.
Yeah.
You will hit your target, or you can use a shotgun, or as I call it, spray and pray.
Yeah.
And I had somebody yesterday, she was a feng shui expert, and it was like, hey, Dave. So I'll give them credit. I get many times, I'm like, hello there. I love your show. And I'm like, well, which one? I got about 6. And it's just so obvious that it's spray and pray, where if you just simply said, hey, Dave, I listened to episode 906 where you were interviewing so-and-so. That's a really cool topic. Have you ever talked about this? And are you looking for guests? That's it. Because so many of them are, look at me. I'm great. I did this great thing here and another great thing here. I invented sliced bread and cured cancer.
Yeah.
All of which has nothing to do. But if you tell me how you're going to help me serve my audience, because every good podcaster, that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
I had another one this week that explained what a great guest they would be for my show, that had they listened to any episode, I've never, ever, ever had a guest. It's a review show. I grab a podcast, I listen to it, and then tell you what I think about it. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh, I loved your show. And I'm thinking, do you really?
Prove it.
Yeah.
I had a note in my inbox this morning for Angie True Bloke, like Blook instead of Blood. And I thought, oh, maybe it's a typo, but then it got repeated throughout. So
Nice.
that was a really special touch.
Yeah.
Let's touch on when you have a guest show up, like when you're interviewing them on the show. Any particular do's and don'ts coming from you who has all of this experience? Like, is there anything that you would love your guests to show up and do that you don't always see?
First, I let them know why you're here. So, like, for instance, I interviewed somebody, she was a musician. Also, she ran an ad agency. And I said, but I'm bringing you on today because you do exactly what I prescribed, which is figure out who your audience is and give them what they want. Because she's a musician that she was being successful getting her music used in like Netflix. So I realized we could talk about work-life balance and all this other stuff. We're going to talk about this. And then I explained to them who my audience is. I'm like, so if you want to get kind of nerdy, I got nerds that listen to my show, so that's fine. I don't really have a time limit on my show. So I usually just go until we're done. If you're trying to get it under 40 minutes, then you might want to tell me because there is the short, middle, and long version of many of my answers. So I'll try to keep them short. And then the other thing I'm going to do is if they show up and they're using their built-in laptop microphone and it sounds like they're in another state, I'm going to go, do you have another microphone? And they go, no, I just use this for the Zoom calls. And I go, yeah, I love your content and I want to make you sound so good. And while that is great for Zoom, this is a podcast, and I really want to make sure my audience can really understand and get every ounce of value out of that. Can I recommend a microphone, and can we reschedule? And people go, but they're your guest. And I go, and if the guest comes in and sounds horrible, what would you say to the person who walks into your house and goes, wow, cool house, and then takes a giant dump in the living room? You'd go, you're not really welcome here right now, and you are the goalie. You are the goalie and your audience is behind you if we're playing soccer or football for those across the pond. And when somebody tries to send me bad audio or bad content, I just smack it out of there. There's a thing called editing that I can do, but
it's not magic.
Yeah, I don't have the time to take your absolutely wretched audio and run it through 15 plugins so that it's almost listenable.
Yeah. I had an instance actually with one of our first interviews for the new version of the podcast. And she's just not a podcaster. And I ran into this. I launched a local show 2 years ago, and it was a bit of a nightmare because I was interviewing people from the community who had no background in podcasting. And even though I would send them information, they would literally be talking into their laptop mic. So then I created a home studio, basically, where I had to traipse them upstairs into our 4th bedroom. But I didn't want to compromise audio. But I'm glad to hear you say that. I've struggled before with a couple of guests to be like, should we just like shut this down and regroup some other time? So I try to be proactive about, you got to show up ideally with a mic. Would you let them, if they had the Apple headphones with the little mic? I'm typically pretty cool with that as long as they're not in a wooden room.
Yeah, that's basically it. I'm not audio snob by any means. I'm going for listenable. There's a really, unfortunately, popular microphone called the Blue Yeti. And it sounds like the best thing ever. Oh, it'll pick up in every direction, especially if you have multiple people. You end up sounding like you're in a bathroom in the cave. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And yes, you can clean that up, but my time is kind of important, not more important than yours, and it's just one of those where I kind of go, wait a minute. So you're an author, you're being a guest on shows, and you didn't think to buy a microphone? I'm like, shame on you, because we're not talking hundreds, $69.
Tops. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure you didn't read it because your audio, you know how to show up as a guest, but we actually have a step-by-step instruction on how to optimize the Blue Yeti. If that is the microphone, we send it to all of our clients and any guests for the show because it is, it's not my favorite.
It's my nemesis. I'm somewhat known for really hating the Blue Yeti.
So am I on my team. And
I just like, I can hear any podcast and go, Blue Yeti. Yep, there it is.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Okay. So the listeners are podcast guests. Like they love to be guests on podcasts, but they're business owners. Many have their own show. And so they're using their podcast really for business purposes. They're not trying to get ad sponsors, but they're likely driving it back to their services. We have a lot of service providers like
That's
me.
the best way to use a podcast, hands down.
Yeah.
Gary Leland found a niche, which was women's fast pitch softball. It was probably on like ESPN 38 or something, right? It wasn't getting a lot of play. And so I don't know why he picked that, but he picked it. And then he had Leland Sporting Goods store. And he said it was interesting because by the time he finished that show, he said, I had every female softball, fast pitch, whatever it was, in his phone that was on the Olympic team. He got to go to, I want to say China, someplace that's not the US, to cover the games for free because he was the media. And he said, I used to spend $10,000, it might have been a year, I don't think it was a month, for Google ads. And he goes, I don't do that anymore. He goes, because I'm getting all this traffic from the podcast. And he goes, and I made up coupon codes. He goes, they're not in my show notes. He goes, I only say them on the air. Yeah. And he goes, and they get used all the time. So I know people are listening.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's the best way to use a podcast.
I just know I love your brain for my people. So where can people connect with you? I looked. Right now it looks like you have 8 podcasts. They're not all active.
No, some of them are and some of them aren't. My flagship is schoolofpodcasting.com. But if you want all things Dave, I finally made a website for this, and that's powerofpodcasting.com.
Yeah. You asked me if you could review my show. Is that for Podcasting Rodeo?
First of all, that's a horrible name, Podcast Rodeo Show, because what do you think it's about? Probably horses.
Horses. I'm fine with that.
And stuff. Yeah. So if you have to explain your name, you've picked a bad name, because my tagline is where you grab a random podcast and see how long you can hold on. And when I went to rebrand, my audience was like, no, we love the rodeo. I'm like, oh, okay. So I added a tagline for that. But yeah, I basically grab your show. Usually I ask you to pick an episode and then I listen to it. It's just off the top of my head, kind of okay. Because the thing I hear a lot is like the music will come in, boom, boom, and I'll go, and the voiceover starts now. Nope. Okay. Or the dreaded double intro where you're like, hey, today we're talking with Angie. She's great. She's the best thing since sliced bread. Here's my talk with Angie.
Angie, who are you?
Yeah. It's like, okay. So a lot of his stuff, I fell victim to this. About 2 months ago, a member of the School of Podcasting said, Dave, you know I love you. And I'm like, okay. And she said, you have a typo in your podcast. And I go, oh, what episode? She goes, no, it's in the name of the show. And I go, what? Which one? And she goes, the School of Podcasting. And I'm like, no way. And sure enough, it was like plan, launch, grow, and monetize your show. You know. And I was like, so you need somebody occasionally to go, do you know that you have a typo? Do you know that you did the double intro? Or do you know your music's too loud or whatever? So yeah, that's the Podcast Rodeo Show.
I was just listening to the one Podcasting Coach where you did the SmartList review and you were listening to the music and you're like, and now start speaking. Because they did have a long music thing.
Yeah.
So
I did have one where somebody begged for 8 minutes. Well, first they begged for money, and then he went into some story about his wife or something. And I was like, this is great stuff at the end of the show where your super listeners who really want to know you are there. But I look at the title of your episode as a promise. Like today we're going to talk about this. And
don't clickbait me.
Yeah. So
awesome. Well, Dave, thank you for being here. I know our listeners are going to pop over and listen to the show for sure. And I just really appreciate your time and the expertise and all that you've done for podcasting, candidly. So thank you.
Angie, thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Okay, friends, I hope you loved that interview. I hope you got lots of tangible takeaways, lots of nuggets that you can implement in your day-to-day pitching and your day-to-day life for sure. And we are actually introducing a new segment this week. It is our Podcast Insider Tip of the Week, where every episode I will be sharing a little bit of inside peeks at what we do with our clients. Sometimes it'll be more like a mini little workshop to help you out, but it'll be a more tangible takeaway of here's insight, now go do this. So this week's Insider Tip of the Week is focused on how to use those interviews to build your know, like, and trust factor. Dave talked a lot about how he uses his podcast to do that. But guess what? If you are consistently guesting on other people's podcasts, you can use those interviews as an asset to build your know, like, and trust factor with your current audience. So how do you do this? Well, obviously, you share your content when your interviews go live. That is bar at ground zero. What we're talking about here is strategically using the interviews that you have go live in a way that nurtures your existing audience. So a couple of examples, it's definitely something that you're going to want to give thought to, but you can use those interviews as content that you refer to consistently. So if someone asks a question of you in a DM or in a training, right? Instead of regurgitating an answer that you've likely shared 100 times before, why don't you refer them to one of the podcast interviews that you had on Susie Q's podcast? It will accomplish a couple of things. One, it will actually answer the question in a more detailed way, most likely. And it will also build your credibility with that person because they will see, oh, this was a podcast host that invited this person on because of their expertise. So referring to those podcast interviews consistently when you're asked questions. If there are stories that are pulled out of you during podcast interviews that you want to share with your existing audience, you can do that on social. You can pull an audiogram and actually share the audio on social media. You could share it inside of an email newsletter, even a welcome series. For a long time before I ever had a podcast, in my initial sort of 5 email sequence when people joined my email list, I would reference different interviews where I had been hosted as a guest so that they could get to know me and really understand how this business came to be. Especially if your business is one that takes a bit of explaining and it's better explained in long form content, a podcast interview is a great way to be able to share that with your audience. And if you have interviews that are about specific types of how-to information, that's a great way to share that content with your audience too. So yes, I've been interviewed on a gazillion different shows all about how to be a great podcast guest, but there's a few that I've been on about hosting a show of your own and how to strategically use a podcast to build your business. Those are the ones that I'm going to be sharing with folks who come to me and ask questions about hosting a podcast. So start to think about your interviews, yes, as pillar content, which we have covered before. I recorded an episode way back, I don't know if it's way back, but back in October of 2022, episode 84, about how you can use your podcast interviews as pillar content. Yes, that is one thing that you can do to use and give more life to your podcast interviews, but you can also use them to increase your audience's know, like, and trust factor for you. Does it require you to put on a different strategy hat? Yes, because you will be focusing on how can I use these interviews not to attract new audience members, but to nurture my existing ones. So think about it. I would love to hear what you come up with. You can shoot me a DM on LinkedIn. What can you offer your existing audience that's new to them that you covered on a podcast interview of your own that helps them to build on what they already know of you? And I give a big kind of hat tip to Dave for helping me come up with this idea of, oh yeah, this is just one more way that podcast interviews can complement a business with just one piece of content. You can use it in a myriad number of ways. So shout out to Dave on helping me through his storytelling recognize really what interviews can do, another layer to the story. Okay, friends, that is it for this week. Like I have mentioned 1,000 times before, connect with me on LinkedIn. That is where I'm most active. Instagram is a bit of a dead zone for us. I'm at Angie Trueblood. Shoot me a connect request and let me know that you heard me on this episode of Pitched, and we can continue the conversation over there. All right, until next time, be well, be visible, and go get pitched. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pitched. If you would love to get pitched to be a guest on podcast, we here at the Podwise Group would love to help you. We offer 2 primary services to support our clients in landing and converting podcast interviews. Whether you want to handle the pitching yourself or you'd like our team to do it all, hop on over to our site, thepodwisegroup.com/services to check out how we can help. If one of them suits your fancy, you can schedule a time to connect with me right there. I am so looking forward to connecting with you.